Uma universidade conectada com o seu tempo, com a ciência e com a formação humana. A Universidade de Caxias do Sul é uma universidade comunitária que tem como missão produzir, sistematizar e socializar o conhecimento com qualidade e relevância para o desenvolvimento sustentável. Conectada com você, sua vida e seus sonhos. Cerca de 100.000 pessoas levam no seu currículo o nome da Universidade de Caxias do Sul. Mas o legado de uma universidade não pode ser só medido pelo número de pessoas que ela formou, mas também pelos conceitos e ideias que ela ajudou a revolucionar, pelas empresas que ajudou a implantar e até mesmo pelos sonhos que ela ajudou a concretizar. A marca da UX ultrapassou as barreiras do tempo e os limites do espaço. Ela está impressa em milhares de histórias e conquistas e segue sua trajetória de sucesso, preparando pessoas com capacidade para transformar o mundo, criar o novo e antecipar o futuro. Universidade de Caxias do Sul.
Boa tarde a todos e a todas. Sejam muito bem-vindos e bem-vindas à nossa 7ª jornada de pesquisa em filosofia do programa de pós-graduação em filosofia aqui da Universidade de Caxias do Sul. Meu nome é Mariana Bernardi, sou doutoranda aqui do programa de filosofia da Universidade de Caxias do Sul. E hoje, então, nós recebemos o professor Andrew Finberg, Eu vou iniciar a apresentação, né? Vou conversar um pouco com o professor Andrew, iniciar a apresentação dele em inglês, depois em português, mas já adianto a todos os ouvintes aí que o professor Andrew é um gentleman, né? Um cavalheiro, então o inglês dele é muito acessível, assim, é bem compreensível, bem inteligível e certamente vai ser uma conferência muito proveitosa. Então, Professor Andrew, I'm going to introduce you in English, then after in Portuguese, and after you can start your presentation. First, thank you for accepting our invitation. It's an honor to welcome you here in our event. Actually, for me especially, it's a pleasure to hear you, to follow your studies. And now I have to make a very short introduction of your work, but I think it's the principle of your studies. Professor Andrew Finberg is a doctor from University of California, San Diego. He works for over 40 years with technology, including at least the last 13 years at Simon Fraser University. During the earlier years of her career, worked and studied with Herbert Marcuse, becoming the Canada Research Chair in Philosophy of Technology, and he's one of the leading philosophers of technology in the world. Author of several books, papers, and lectures, some of which translated for even 6 languages. I will cite 3 of them: Between Reason and Experience, Essays in Technology and Modernity, The Philosophy of Praxis, Marx, Lukács, and the Frankfurt School, and Technosystem, The Social Life of Reason. And I will say a little sentence that you refer in Simon Fraser University. My advice to young researchers is to follow your own path rather than fashion. Então, o professor Andrew Finberg, né, ele é doutor pela Universidade da Califórnia, em San Diego, trabalhou por pelo menos 40 anos com tecnologia, incluindo pelo menos 13 desses, os últimos 13, né, na Simon Fraser University, no Canadá. Os primeiros anos, então, de trabalho da carreira dele, trabalhou, né, estudou com Herbert Marcuse. Ele detém uma cadeira, enfim, né, nesse empreendimento de pesquisa do Canadá, né, um programa de pesquisa em filosofia da tecnologia, autor de diversos livros, artigos e palestras, alguns dos quais traduzidos em pelo menos 6 idiomas, entre eles, né, Entre Razão e Experiência, Ensaios de Tecnologia e Modernidade, Filosofia da Praxis, Marx, Lukács e a Escola de Frankfurt, e Tecnosistema, a Vida Social da Razão. E aí eu citei uma frase que o professor Andrew Finberg falou, que o conselho dele para os jovens pesquisadores era seguir o seu próprio caminho ao invés da moda, né? Então, muito obrigada, professor. You can start your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariana. I will try to speak slowly, and I have slides which contain the main points of the lecture. So hopefully that will make it easier for you to follow, even though I'm speaking a foreign language, foreign for you. Mariana mentioned some of my books. 3 of them are translated into Portuguese. And at the end of this talk, I will show you the covers of those 3 books. And you can also find more resources from my work on my YouTube channel. I'm on YouTube. If you look it up by my name, I think you can find it quickly. So let me begin. I'm going to try and show the slides. Where did they go? Uh-oh.
Juliana, can
There
help.
they are.
Yeah. Oh.
Okay. Now somehow I have to move myself. I can't see myself. Can someone help me? Yeah, but it covers me, so I don't see myself, which is uncomfortable. Do you see me?
Yes.
You don't see the slides.
No.
Okay, let's try again. Share. Now? Ah, whoops, what happened?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
here we go. Now I can see myself. I'm very small, but I'm there. So this is a talk on democratic rationalization. That's a concept I have developed. It's, I think, pretty much unique to me, but I'll explain it here in detail. So let me begin here with the concept of rationalization. You may be familiar with this concept if you've studied sociology. It was introduced by the German sociologist Max Weber, one of the founders of sociology. And Weber thought that modern societies were unique because in modern societies, there is a great emphasis on calculation and control. We try and figure out exactly how much resources we need, how much we have spent. We have accountants to tell us where the money went. We keep track in a way that is um, remarkable, not just in a few areas, because perhaps in Mesopotamia, the ancient kings kept track of the grain in their store. We keep track of everything. And that's really quite unusual. There's no historical precedent for such an emphasis on calculation in social life. And also, Weber pointed out that control figures in our society in a unique way. We are much more anxious to oversee workers, to oversee members of society, make sure that we know what they're doing, when, and why, than in earlier societies that had far fewer resources for controlling their members. So this enabled Weber to contrast modernity with tradition. These are the two poles of his sociology. Modernity is the kind of world we live in, and it would be unrecognizable to people from 500 years ago, say, who lived in traditional societies. And similarly, we could not find our way in their society, so different is it from ours. Now, modernity is based on technical disciplines. And this is a point which is not always appreciated by people who write about technology and modernity. Technologies don't exist all by themselves as things. They exist as expressions of technical disciplines. And these disciplines are mastered by experts who know how to use them to design technologies and systems. So several of these technical disciplines are most often discussed today. For example, engineering, which allows engineering experts to make bridges that don't fall down and cars that travel successfully on the road. Then there's also disciplines of management and administration that enable bureaucracies to organize their cases and to manage their personnel. Of course, we could name others. I mean, there's medicine too. Medicine is a technical discipline which concerns a very large part of economic activity in modern societies. And there's, of course, research through which innovation takes place. Now, these technical disciplines appear as quasi-scientific. they look almost like sciences. But in reality, they are not sciences, not in the sense in which physics or chemistry is a science. Why? Because they are deeply embedded in social life. They do not abstract so completely from social life as physics and chemistry. And this shows up, among other things, in the role that control from above plays in these disciplines. In modern capitalist society, it is taken for granted that things can only get done when someone is in charge. There must be someone above the work group who gives them their orders and makes sure they do the job. So this fundamental assumption of capitalism infiltrates these disciplines and gives them a certain bias. This is especially obvious in the case of management, but it shows up in technology as well. So let me go on now to the next slide. Actually, no, I can't. Okay, so modern societies are unique, as I've said. They're very rich, much richer than any previous society. And that, of course, affects all of us because we participate to some extent in this immense wealth rather than, say, working as farmers on the land with primitive implements. But the richness goes along with problems. These are problematic societies, and I'm going to list some of the problematic aspects of modernity. First, there are technocratic tendencies, a tendency to treat everything as a technical problem. And this blocks what should be valuative, normative discussion, normative debate over what our response should be to the problems that we face. If everything is a technical problem, then nothing concerns values, and we are really not involved because experts can handle all of this better than we ever could. This technocratic tendency is deplorable, and it's anti-democratic. Then there's also the problem of consumerism and the mass media, a tendency for people in modern societies to focus exclusively on possessions, on buying things, and the mass media, of course, broadcast propaganda of all sorts. So in the worst case, you have people who are selfish and stupid. They just want to buy things and they can't think for themselves. And this is not a entirely a mythic complaint, as you can tell from politics in countries like the ones we live in. Then there's the problem of environmental crisis, the destruction of the rainforest in Brazil, the climate catastrophe that affects the whole planet. And this problem results from certain features of modern societies, essentially from a short-term view of problems that goes along with capitalist ideas about investment. And another more recent problem is surveillance and social control through the media, through social networks. Everyone now is aware of the evils of Facebook and Google. These features of the internet are frightening and suggest a kind of dystopian world in which we really count only as relays, links between giant financial and bureaucratic systems that control us completely. And finally, there's the point I mentioned earlier about technocracy, this technical mentality that does not just concern experts and government officials, but the general public. It reaches out to the general public and gives people the sense that they really don't need to concern themselves with moral and spiritual issues, because everything is a technical problem. So philosophy of technology has emerged as a critique of these tendencies of modern societies. It usually is not interested in going back to the Middle Ages. That's not a real option. However, if you are concerned about the future of modern society, social critique is an important step toward building that future in a better way. The goal that I pursue, and that many other people in the field of philosophy of technology pursue, is a more democratic form of modernity. But this would mean a more democratic rationalization process, something that Weber did not imagine possible. Now, if you want to continue studying this subject, I recommend a book. And this is a book of my teacher, Herbert Marcuse. I found the Portuguese version. So I recommend it to you because it is a fascinating book. It was written in 1964, but it feels very contemporary. It is certainly much more relevant today than many of the contemporary authors who we are encouraged to read by the fashions of the publishing industry and academe. Okay, so there are theoretical issues involved in philosophy of technology, and I'm going to talk about some of them here. First of all, there is an obstacle to the development of a democratic rationalization theory. And this obstacle is called technological determinism. It's a popular view of technology that's widely held by the general public and by some philosophers. And I can summarize it in 3 propositions. First of all, the notion that technology develops on a single track. It has only one way to go, and that's, of course, progress, up, better. Secondly, that track is governed by science and the pursuit of efficiency. So technological development is not really up to us, it's up to science and the measurement of efficiency. And finally, society must adapt to the imperatives of the technologies as they emerge. We are simply, we're not in control of technology, it is in control of us. So what's wrong with determinism? It sounds pretty plausible. However, if you study the history of technology, you discover that development branches in many directions. There is no single track. There could be very different ways of making automobiles, of designing urban transportation, different methods for medicine, for production techniques, and so on. And these branches are selected by social influences. So there's a famous essay by Trevor Pinch and I'm afraid I forget momentarily the other author. The essay describes the early origins of the bicycle. In the 1880s and 1890s, there were 2 very different designs of the bicycle that were quite popular. One had large front wheels and a small rear wheel, and this bicycle was designed to go very fast. And so it appealed to young men trying to impress the ladies, but it was unstable. People who were interested in using bicycles not for racing, but for transportation, wanted bicycles with wheels the same size. They were slow, but they were stable. And these two forms of the bicycle were in competition for many years in the early phase of the development of the technology. So here you had two branches that eventually resolved into a single branch, the bicycle as we know it today. But various innovations made that possible, essentially inflatable tires and gear shifts, and those innovations made it possible to combine the features of both branches in a single combined branch. So this is a famous story because it illustrates the fact that the development of technology is not deterministic. There are several branches and there are outcomes that are socially determined in large part, of course, also governed by the available innovations. So we need to look then at a reciprocal influence of technology and society rather than a deterministic influence of technology on society. Now, I summarize this in the notion that technology has double aspects. It's a twofold phenomenon. On the one hand, it's technical in the sense that those technical disciplines I mentioned can explain all the causal mechanisms that make it work. But it's also cultural because social influences affect design and give technologies a meaning in the social world. The function and meaning are the two aspects, technical function and cultural meaning. Technology, the meaning of technology is so central that it is around us all the time, but easily overlooked. I'll give you another example, a funny example. When in the early 20th century, people had ice boxes. An ice box was a big box that was insulated and in which you could put a block of ice. And then you could put meat in there and milk and it would stay cool. Eventually, it was discovered that you could hook up a refrigeration machine to the ice box. So now you had two boxes in your house, one that was the ice box, no longer containing ice, just an insulated box, and then a mechanical device that was plugged into it and that kept it cool. Because there was a mechanical device involved, and because machines are signified, at least were then in society, as masculine, machines are gendered entities in the old culture, ice boxes, which now became refrigerators, were a male technology. Well, this seemed wrong and inefficient to the people who designed refrigerators. And at some point, a genius figured out that if you could hide the machinery, then the refrigerator would fit into the kitchen and would no longer be a complicated male technology out in the woodshed, but a female technology in the kitchen along with the stove and the kitchen cabinets. And this would, of course, greatly increase the interest of consumers, women consumers, in owning refrigerators. And so they devised what we now know as a refrigerator with the motor on the bottom hidden from the user and the cold area above it. And this they called streamlining. I don't know why. And it became the standard way in which refrigerators were designed and made refrigerators a very popular technology. So you can see from an example like this how cultural meaning infiltrates design and affects the functions of devices. And this also penetrates into technical disciplines. Think about the automobile. In 1950, an automotive engineer would have learned a lot of things about motors and wheels and axles, but he would have learned nothing about pollution. Pollution control was not part of the discipline of automotive engineering back then. But today, if you want to become an automotive engineer, you have to find out a lot about catalytic converters and carburetors and fuel injection and different types of fuel. Your technical training will be different because the society has decided that the automobile must be less polluting. There's nothing technically inevitable or imperative about this. It's a social decision. Now, in philosophy, we have the category of life world, the lived world. It comes from German Lebenswelt, and it describes the world of meaning in which we all function every day, all day long. And technology belongs to the life world. But remember, it's double aspects. It also belongs to the world of technical disciplines. And so it is a peculiar phenomenon that's quite difficult for people to understand. Now I want to turn to another aspect. Because technology is difficult to understand, because it is often confounded with its technical function and its cultural and political aspects ignored, it has a tremendous political power. We take the world as given, and there's a kind of non-coercive power in the way in which the technologies direct our activities. So, for example, although it is absurd to use an automobile in Sao Paulo, people take it for granted that this is the way to go. And because other arrangements are not convenient, because they haven't been made convenient by the authorities, it seems that transportation by automobile is normal. This taken for granted nature of the technical environment contributes to what is called hegemony. Hegemony is a non-coercive power based on shared meanings, on what seems natural, obvious, rational. Hierarchical control of technical operations is an example of a hegemonic assumption that has influenced the development of technology. For example, throughout the 19th century, capitalists worked to de-skill the occupations that went on in their factories. They tried to remove the skills and make the work as easy as possible for the most unskilled members of the workforce. For example, children. Design here, the design of the technology, is influenced by, biased by, the hierarchical assumptions that are part of the capitalist system. I call such assumptions a technical code or a design code. It's a code of assumptions that supports design in conformity with hegemonic beliefs. But here's an example. This is a cotton mill in the American South in the 1920s. And you can see that it is set up in such a way as to be operated by a 10-year-old girl. She has the controls at her height. If the mill were to be operated by adults, you'd have to change the design of the machinery. So here, because it was obvious that children are workers, controls were designed into the device in such a way as to be accessible to children. The technology displays the hegemonic assumption about the nature of the workforce. So let me turn now to another feature of this philosophy of technology I'm developing. We think of, in everyday life, we think of the facts, acknowledgement of the facts as a rational behavior. It's rational when you have a bad fever to assume that you've got an infection and go to the doctor. That's what we mean by everyday rationality. In contrast, values appear subjective. We think of our values, our preferences, and our moral beliefs as mental. They're not facts, they're in our head. But the weird thing about technology is that it incorporates values in its design. We decide what kind of people we are, what kind of society we live in, what is important to us by the design of our technologies. So, for example, the automobile again suggests an individualistic idea of life because we control when we go and when we return. We don't engage in some collective process as we would if we took the bus or a subway. We are individuals, independent, free, and people actually they accept advertising on television, which points to their freedom and which tries to dramatize the freedom of the owner of the automobile. So we have now incorporated the idea of freedom into a large chunk of steel called an automobile. Now, this is typical of how facts incorporate values in the sphere of technology. But we don't think of it this way because the facts are the facts. So there's a kind of technological unconsciousness. We explain technologies by their function. The automobile is a transportation means. That's how we understand it. But this obscures the meaning and the history of the automobile, which was developed as a consumer product at a certain time for certain purposes, essentially purposes of capitalist enterprise. So in everyday life, people assume that technologies are purely rational when in fact their design incorporates values. Let me give you an example of how history affects technical design. This is an exit sign from a theater. And I assume that in Brazil too, it's legally required to have exit signs in every theater. And this seems perfectly rational. We would normally assume that the reason there are exit signs in theater is the function they serve, namely to help people escape in the event of fire. But in practice, in reality, at least in the United States, exit signs were not present in theaters until a certain historical event dramatized their importance. And that was the Iroquois theater fire in 1903. Hundreds of people died because they could not find the exit during a fire. And after that, the city fathers of all the cities in America demanded that theaters have exit signs. So you can see that the exit sign emerges not just from a rational function, but also from a historical event that affected people's imagination and their understanding of life. Okay, so technology is part of the hegemonic system that confines us to the existing society and its many flaws. How can we break the hegemonic circle by which technology confirms that life must go on the way it always has? Well, there is a way to break the circle. Social movements have begun, especially since World War II, to have a significant influence on the design of technology. There's a whole series of these events that have occurred in which social movements have affected technical decisions and improved, and in most cases, made for better ones. So let me go through some of the main ones. First, at the end of World War II, scientists who had made nuclear weapons became alarmed at the possibility they would be used to destroy civilization. And they promoted a social movement for disarmament. And this movement was eventually successful, if not in disarming Russia and the United States, at least in getting them to stop testing weapons above ground and eventually underground as well. And a regime of non-proliferation was created, treaties were signed, and this social movement had an impact on the world we live in which we no longer live in constant fear of nuclear war. Another example is medicine. There have been huge changes in medicine, partly the result of innovation, but also changed attitudes. For example, there's the famous case of AIDS. I'm not sure what you call that in Portuguese, SIDA perhaps, in which the patients themselves became a social movement. They organized a social movement to get better access to experimental medicines. And they were successful in changing the way in which medicine was practiced in their case. Then, of course, there's ecology, and we're all familiar with the importance of social movements in getting air pollution legislation passed, although I understand that it's somewhat lacking in Sao Paulo and perhaps in other cities in Brazil, but eventually it will be implemented, protecting people from contaminated water. These are the results of public pressures. And now climate change, the pressure on the governments comes from a public that is alarmed at the future, despite the fact that some efforts are being made by business and government under this public pressure. And then lastly, mention hacking. The hacking of computer systems by users and outsiders, outside experts, has resulted in many changes. The internet as we know it is basically the result of hacking reabsorbed by corporations into their practices and made useful for their financial bottom line. So here we see human values entering technology through social movements with progressive consequences. This is a kind of democratic intervention, a democratic intervention into technology. Why has it occurred in this way? Well, I think this has to do with the capitalist heritage, with the fact that capitalism is a system that frees owners of enterprise from many considerations that might otherwise concern them, such as the welfare of workers, the welfare of the environment, nature, the welfare of the communities in which factories are situated. And for the first 100 years, 150 years or so of rapid capitalist development and industrialization, capitalists were able to ignore these other aspects of their world in the pursuit of profit. By leaving communities and workers and concern with nature out of the process of design, they came up with technologies that appear to us today as problematic. Now, for a long time, workers and communities had no say. It was impossible for them to influence design. But now this is no longer the case, especially since the end of World War II. More and more communities and workers are able to impose regulation and reputational costs on business. And the result of this public resistance is changes in technology, a kind of democratic intervention into technology. Now note, I'm not saying that we vote on technologies. That's not how it works. It works by social movements formulating values in language, expressing their concerns in language, and bringing their concerns to the attention of political leaders and business leaders who eventually charge experts with realizing those values in the technological facts. So often you do get a kind of resistance on the part of the people in charge. They say these values are merely ideologies. This was the way people talked about ecology 50 years ago. It was an ideological imposition that would impoverish society. It would ruin everything for everyone. Well, those were the same arguments that were made about child labor in the 19th century. In fact, technology is very flexible. And once they were forced to engage with ecology, businesses managed quite easily to adjust to the new conditions under which they were forced to operate. So I conclude that values are the facts of the future. What today looks like a solid fact actually incorporates past values, and the future technologies will incorporate the values of today. And this is the sense in which we can talk about something like a democratic technology. Okay, so I have spoken long enough, I think. I promised to show you my books. Here they are. They're published by Innovatech, and they're translated, ably translated. I'm sure you can get them on Amazon or some other website if they're not in your local bookstore. So let me conclude now and see if you have questions or comments you'd like to share with me. And I'm going to, I guess I'll close this window now that you've had a chance to see the books. Okay.
Thank you, Professor Andrew. Wow, I appreciate it a lot. First, I'm going to give a space for other who maybe want to make a question, because I have my question to do, but I have to wait. I don't know, Daniel and Aline, tem alguma pergunta no chat? Senão eu vou começar a fazer a primeira pergunta para o professor Andrew.
You can start asking him. We doesn't have any yet.
Okay. So, Professor, We are continually transforming ourselves or reducing ourselves into technical process. And when we did that, we introjected values that are subjective, ensuring that such and such values are allowed. The system, the capitalism, determines what is the values that are allowed, not only from a moral point of view, but also from a legal view and even political view. It is an universalization of behaviors. This process is at the service of capitalism, if I understood correctly.
Yes.
My question is, you talk about social movements to force some kind of change, but we have millions and millions of people in a state of misery. How can we think about in all these people that can fight against the system? Because I think money can be a great weapon to fight. But this money, this power is concentrated in a few people. So I wanna hear about how can we make this social movement with these people that are fragile, that are I don't know how to say desprovido. Maybe my colleagues can help me. Daniel e Aline, me ajudem a fazer a tradução quando não se tem condições financeiras o suficiente. Não há força para... Me ajuda, Aline, com a tradução disso?
Well, I think I understand your question without that particular word.
Because money is the value that capitalism works.
It's not fair. I agree. It's not fair. There's much more power on the side of business than on the side of the public. However, that doesn't mean that the public is completely helpless. And there are phases in the history of countries in which public action is more or less effective. Right now in Brazil, you are in a phase where there is a very strong social movement on the right that simply wants to benefit the existing system, that does not resist in any way the depredations of capitalism, for example, in the Amazon. This powerful conservative social movement is it controls a lot of the institutions, but there's also a lot of resistance. There's a lot of people who are opposed, and you have an election coming soon in which it's possible that things will be reversed, as they have in the United States with the defeat of Donald Trump in the last election. And hopefully, that is a precedent for what will happen in Brazil. Let's hope. So things go up and they go down, and there's no, unless someday capitalism itself is replaced by a different system, this is going to be the way it is. But it's not a question of a dictatorship, an absolute dictatorship of capital. Capitalism adjusts to pressures from below, if those pressures are strong enough, and finds its way of making money regardless. So that's my answer to your question.
That's my hope too. The next
I saw there.
elections. Oh my God, we are entering a collapse here in Brazil. Oh my God.
Yeah,
Just
it's
for God.
scary.
Thank you, Professor. We have more questions now. Just wait a second. Aline, do you want to make them, or Danielle?
Okay. The first one made by Thor Veres. Professor Finberg, thanks for your talk. The proposal of democratic rationalization is closer to Marcusean idea of a new sensibility. Or,
Of what?
yeah, in fact,
Uh,
it's also in the chat.
just
Uh,
repeat the word. Inclusivity?
Let me see. The proposal of a democratic rationalization is closer to Marcusean.
Marcusean.
Marcusean?
Marcuse. Reference to Herbert Marcuse. Marcusean.
Oh, okay. I didn't know it.
Yes, yes.
Idea of a new sensibility, or Habermasian idea
Habermas. Jürgen Habermas.
of communicative rationalization, and that's a question. How to prevent this democratic technology platform from becoming a reificated technological solutionism that may be a new liberal ideology?
Well, it's rather it's difficult for me to understand. But I think what the question is about is whether what I'm arguing has some relation, how it relates to Marcuse and Habermas,
Yes, that
and
is. Yes.
and it relates to both in that Marcuse believed he could see signs in the student movement and in 1968 in France in the workers' movement as well of a really fundamental desire on the part of people to change life, to change the system. In other words, not just a personal opinion that you might talk to someone about in a bar, but a quasi-physical need for a different way of life. And this idea is a little bit, I mean, you can connect it to Habermas's notion of communicative rationality, because it has a rational basis. It's based in a sense of what society could be, what its potentials could be if it were transformed in a democratic way. However, Habermas's view remains exclusively at the level of discourse, of opinion, and Marcuse felt that fundamental change would require a kind of existential commitment, not just opinions or ideas. So it's really closer. What I'm arguing is something like Marcuse's view, but without where it's similar to Habermas is that Marcuse was in favor of a total revolution and didn't really have much help to offer for what we should do in the meantime. Now, there were issues in his day, racial justice issues, the war in Vietnam, and these issues were the basis for the left. But let me turn off my phone. These issues were for him just sort of basic starting points for a general revolution. Habermas was more reformist, and I must admit to being more reformist myself, given the way things have evolved long since Marcuse's death, with growing conservatism on the part of advanced societies. And so it's the idea of a total revolution that Marcuse put forward seems less plausible today. Now, I think the last part of the question was, how do you keep this from being neoliberal? Depends what you mean by neoliberal. I could imagine a accumulation of struggles around technology and other issues leading eventually to a socialist alternative to capitalism. But that is not on the agenda today, not for any large number of people. So what we're working with is what we can force capitalism to do in the way of ecological reform and social justice. And we can force it to do quite a bit. And that's what we should be doing. There's nothing particularly neoliberal about that. It's simply the fact that we do not have an option today to overthrow capitalism and replace it with a different system. So we need to put as much pressure on it as we can to reform its worst excesses. Next question.
Okay, now I'm gonna read the next question. It's from Ismail Fagundes. In a way, maybe we can use technology for solve health problems, but going beyond that, we can use it for enhancements, like the transhumanists advocates. What do you think about it? There's risks in enhancing our organisms, or it can lead us to be a better well-being.
Okay, I think the idea of enhancement is just silly. When you see all the risks involved in regular medicine that treats diseases that might be fatal, and it seems to me quite implausible that people will take the risks involved in enhancing themselves when they have a perfectly functioning body. You already see, I mean, to some extent, you see this problem with cosmetic surgery, right? Where there are risks involved in cosmetic surgery. Do you really want to take those risks? Well, some people will, but those risks in cosmetic surgery are better understood and less significant than what people talk about with enhancement through, I don't know, genetic engineering and things like that. Also, I mean, there's also a reason of principle to oppose enhancement. I mean, of course, we want to save people from terrible genetic problems like I'm blocking on the name, you know, the people can't breathe. We want to use genetic engineering to solve medical issues that arise from genetic defects, but that's quite different from enhancement. Enhancement means that we take the genetic heritage that has evolved over millions of years, and we think we can do better. Well, that's just not plausible. We will simplify ourselves in just the same way we simplify the things we convert into technologies. And that simplification will at some point in the future prove disastrous. So, I mean, if everyone is going to look like Brad Pitt and Jennifer Lopez, we'll find out at some point that that's a mistake, that there were other consequences of such a choice that that aren't compatible with human well-being and survival. So I am opposed to this idea. I think it is mainly of interest to philosophers who love to have some dramatic or melodramatic argument to make, to call attention to the importance of their discipline. But I don't think ordinary people are likely to buy it.
Okay, thank you, Professor. I'm going to read the third question. It's from Cacilda Jandira Mesomo. Can we expect the reality of an effectively democratic technology in the near future? And she also wants to grade you, teacher, for the great talk. And that's it.
Okay, I don't see what my theory is about what I call democratic interventions. We inherit a certain technical world from capitalist industrialization, and now we are in the process of modifying it. And some of those modifications are the result of innovations, but many of them are also the result of changed preferences on the part of the public and public pressures that affect regulation. So we intervene democratically in modifying this heritage, but we don't democratize it in the same sense in which law, for example, is subject to control by elected representatives. We're not, technology is a bit different because there is a mediation. There's this heritage which is invaluable, even though it may contain many bad normative features in the design, we need it. And we have to work from it and modify it. And then there's the mediation of technical experts. There's nothing comparable in the sphere of law, where the basic arguments are open to general understanding, whereas that is not true in the case of engineering. So we're much more dependent on the past and on expertise in the case of technology, and can't really expect to simply vote in the next good technology the way we might vote in a better government administration. So, but democratic interventions have had a huge impact on technology since World War II, and I expect them to continue and to increase in influence in the future.
Do we have time for one more question or not?
It's okay with me.
Okay, so the last question, I think, is there a need for an ethics for artificial intelligence?
Well, of
That
course,
one is from Cristiano Silva de Carvalho.
yes, of course. Ethical considerations should influence the technical experts who work on the subject. I mean, look at this company in Israel, Pegasus, that has developed surveillance technology that's been used to persecute journalists and dissenters all around the world. The people who did that are shits and should be punished. They should have been much more careful about who they sold their technology to. And the Israeli government should have been better, more active in policing their activities. So, I mean, you have the case, for example, of the French government actually demanding that the Israeli government prevent this company from selling its technology in France. So this is rotten. And the people who do this are rotten. But there will always be people. That's what Mariana was worried about. Money works. There will always be people. So ultimately, although I agree there should be ethical standards that influence the decisions of technical experts, in the end, there must be laws. there must be laws, because without laws, it'll be impossible to control the behavior of the technical experts who lack any ethical commitments. They must be coerced by law into obeying our standards and not allowed to roam free, as they have apparently in the case of this Israeli company. Okay, I think we've reached the end. So It was a pleasure talking to you.
Oh my God, the pleasure of our pleasure, our honor. Oh my God, I think I can't stop hearing you. I will listen to you all the night if it is possible.
Well, send me the URL for the YouTube, and I'll put the program on my channel.
Okay, I will do
where
that.
People can listen to it again.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor.
Mr. Finberg, thank you for your lecture.
Thanks for the invitation. I'm going to sign off now.
Okay, have a nice day, Professor. See you
You
next
too.
time. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Juliana, eu acho que não apareceu o formulário para o pessoal.
Então, pessoal, só avisando, né, que temos as mesas agora, a continuação das mesas, né, com as comunicações da parte da tarde, e ao final da tarde, então, ali, entre 7 e 7h30, o início das conferências da noite, né, então, convidando todos para estarem participando das mesas, das comunicações dessa tarde, e mais à noite também as duas conferências com o professor Lucas Dalzotto e a professora Helena. Então, acho que é isso, e para o pessoal acompanhar no chat ali também a lista de presença, né, dessa conferência aqui. É isso. Obrigada, pessoal. Até daqui a pouco nas mesas.